Hey guys, so I'm going to kind of talk about the second part, which is just analyzing the text briefly and what we can glean from it. So talking about feminism and waves, Nicholson kind of talks about how that leaves out a large part of the feminist movement. Specifically like the work that was done. The second wave is kind of the 60s through the 80s, and then there's another third wave that'd be more like modern feminism. So she kind of talks about the work that was done between the 80s and the 2000s, specifically like the implementation of women's studies programs, establishment of rape crisis centers and shelters for victims of domestic abuse, creation of women's caucuses, and then the formation of women's political organizations. This is when feminism started kind of quietly institutionalizing, which is pretty cool. Another thing too that she talks about is how there wasn't all good in that time. There's still some bad news. The wage gap continues to exist. There are rigid and narrow standards of beauty. There's a sexual double standard among young women and men. And the the second wave of feminism in the 60s through the 80s has kind of didn't really accomplish addressing that. And so just talking about it in waves, it kind of doesn't talk about those issues that are still very prevalent today. So another thing that she kind of talks about is that feminism of the 60s, 70s, and 80s continues to achieve what it has to the extent its message has resonated with the felt needs of many. So certain aspects of those movements that did speak to the problems and tensions expressed by many have continued to generate change. And then more change at that time. The change has continued and has exponentially grown now. So the wave metaphor kind of doesn't take into account all of these things, especially radical feminism as well. Since radical feminism was in this kind of the classic form of radical feminism was in the 60s through the 70s and 80s. This was only a small segment of the U.S. kind of talked about radical feminism, but since this second wave, it kind of brings it more to a forefront. So Nicholson doesn't think we need to use them. The wave metaphor is not being productive. However, she said there are some productive aspects. It's really productive in talking about like the big social movements. So she says, to identify those movements in history when issues of gender mobilized large numbers of people in very public, noisy, and challenging ways. That is, when such issues are able to generate large-scale social or political movements. So she says this is where the wave metaphor might still be used. So I put in my notes, what about like the third wave when the women's marches kind of took charge again a couple of years ago? That made me think of that. So I think the wave metaphor, like Nicholson says, leaves out a lot. But I think it's also a great way to kind of think about the feminist, like, big social movements, not necessarily the, like, philosophical arguments of each of the time periods, but just in general, like, the first wave being, like, the original suffrage movement, like, people getting out there trying to get the vote, and then second wave being, like, in the 60s through the 80s, and then if there's a third wave, kind of more recent social change. And that can go just beyond like women's marches. It could be like Black Lives Matter, stuff like that. So yeah, that was kind of quick analysis, but here we go.